Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the annual Lee B. Anderson Memorial Lecture. And tonight we have a special event in which we're going to screen a film and have a lecture and a conversation on the film. The film, as you can see, is The Golem. For those of you who attended the Gothic Vision seminar that I taught with Paul Stearton back in the day about Gothic art from the Gothic invasions to post-punk, know that this film is a very central moment in the history of the development of what we call Gothic. And for those of you who took the magic seminar, know that things like automata, water clocks, robots, etc., all are part of this world that make the Golem and its film. And tonight, we have, I think, the most world-renowned scholar of the Golem, and that's Maya Barzilai, who comes to us from Ann Arbor in Michigan. And before that, she was in Berkeley. And before that, she was in Jerusalem. And she wrote not one, but two books on the Golem. The first is from 2016, and it's called Golem, Modern Wars and Their Monsters. And the second that came out 2 years ago centers more on the film, I think, and it's called Golem, How He Came into the World, and that's basically about the 1920 film with a design by Hans Poelzig, which I think we will hear more about later. And so Maya will give a short introduction to the film, we will watch the film, and then Maya will give a longer post-face or a lecture. So let us welcome Maya and let us welcome the Golem.
The Golem is here. The Golem has come to New York from Michigan. So thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Rain or shine, more rain. And I want to just give a huge shout out to the team here at Bard Graduate School that I worked with, Nadine and Jason and Andrew and everyone else. You did an amazing job setting this up. So thank you so much. I'm really happy to present on my favorite film, possibly. And as Itai said, the film that I wrote a short book about, the Golem, How He Came into the World. That's the translation of the German title. This is a 1920 Weimar era film classic. We don't have a lot of Weimar films that have survived. So the reason we do have some Weimar film is because they were exported. So the films that came to other places in the world, in this case, Italy, Russia, New York City, even in 1921, and export copies remained. We're so lucky to have them. This particular version that you're going to see tonight was restored in 2018. It was a collaboration, and you'll read some information about that at the start of the film, between the Wilhelm Murnau Foundation in Germany and the Royal Film Archive in Belgium. The tinting that you're going to see is original to the time period. There are beautiful colors, pink shades, orange, greens, blues. It's not something that was added later. You're also going to hear, so that is original, but what's new that you're going to see is, or hear, is the music. It was composed and performed by Stephen Horn, a British pianist. So that's just a little bit of like what this specific version that you're going to see is like, a little bit about about who made it and why it came into the world. So as you can see in this poster, and Itai referenced it, everything is alive in this film, right? The Gothic here is not a static thing, but it's a moving object full of momentum and life. And the person behind all of this, his name is Paul Wegener. He's a German actor. He's a very famous theater actor in his 20s and 30s, and very early on in Weimar, in pre-Weimar film, in kind of pre-World War I cinema, he discovered the medium of cinema and became a very famous film actor and director and screenplay writer. He was enchanted with the adaptation of fairy tales or literary folklore into the medium of film. You can see a few of his other costumes here. He also is very well known for a 1913 film, The Student of Prague, where he plays the famous student and his double. I won't get into too much into that detail, but I just want to note the connection of Prague to the Golem. and how Hebrew and Jewish mysticism is already becoming a decorative element in cinema already in 1913. And that is the interior of the Old New Synagogue, where the Golem supposedly rests in the attic to this very day. So the connection to Prague starts already in 1913. But in 1914, Paul Wegener decides to make his first Golem film. Unfortunately, that film is lost. We only have a few minutes left that were discovered accidentally. He made then a 1917 film called The Golem and the Dancer, and then finally his famous 1920 film. So I want just to, again, we're going to see a film that's really highly designed and highly constructed. So I want you to show you this still where you can see, oh, they're just outdoors on top of a regular tower. You know, it's an outdoor shot. The golem here is de-animated, turned back into a sculpture. It's about to be destroyed. So in the 1914 film, we don't have yet the Gothic aesthetic that's going to develop after World War I. Okay, so here we are in Prague, and just one word about the Golem before you watch the film. Paul Wegener, of course, drew from many different sources, and there are many different narratives about the Golem, and not all of them take place in Prague. But the Prague version, which is very famous, involves a well-known 16th century rabbi. His name is Rabbi Judah ben Bezalel Lev or Levi. He's known as the Maharal of Prague. In reality, the historical Maharal had nothing to do with mysticism, Jewish mysticism, or golem making, but some scholars argue that that made him even a better subject to cast the golem upon, to give the golem legitimacy. And then in 1909, a Polish writer wrote this hagiography of the Rabbi Lev with a lot of interesting details about the making of the golem. And one of them was that the golem was made to avert attacks on Jews. So that's where it all started, actually in 1909. And that's a theme that comes up in the film because the golem is there created for a purpose. It's not just created to, I don't know, fetch water and carve wood and clean the rabbi's home. It's created to defend the Jews. And that all started in 1909. So just to give you a little bit of background on how the golem became a protector or a defender of the Jewish population. And the one thing that's really interesting that Wegener adds is this love triangle. And I'm not going to give you any spoiler alerts about that, but just be aware. And the term triangle is going to be key to what I'm going to talk about later on, because triangles are the most important design kind of structure in this film. You see them everywhere in the stars, in the arches, in the facades of homes, in the pillars. So triangle, and that kind of love plot combined with a drama about the Jewish population is also something very typical for the expressionist drama of Wegener's time period. So as you can tell, he was a very golem-obsessed director and actor, 3 golem films in a row. But after the 1920 film, that was it for him. He moved on to other subject matter. And I think really the key to the golem is that it enabled him to develop his approach to cinema. Golem is about animation. It's taking an inanimate object, a piece of clay or a sculpture, and turning it into something that moves, follows orders, even sometimes has a will of its own. So that illusion of animation, what is that if not film? And that's exactly what Wegener understood. He said that the golem is the most suitable subject matter for cinema. So I really hope you enjoy this film and all of the things that were invented to make this film happen. This was before special effects, and they had to do everything from scratch. I really hope you pay attention. Of course, you have already your eyes attuned to design elements and architecture. These are very expressive set designs, and as Itai mentioned, they were made by a famous architect that I'll talk about later, Hans Poelzig, and what they really stress is a continuum between the living and the world around them. So everything in front of the camera is part of one living organism. That continuum between the organic and the anorganic, the living and the dead, that's what this film is really about. Okay, that's it for my short intro and more about the film after the screening, and enjoy it. Can you believe 104 years have passed? Seems very to be animating the audience, like hearing you laugh. It's hard to believe that this is labeled as a horror film, but so it is. It's considered one of the classic horror films that inspired later horror. But what I'm going to focus on today, because of the context we're in, the Libby Anderson Memorial Lecture and the Bard Graduate School, is design of costume, design of interiors and architecture. But of course, we can discuss any aspect of the film later on. So this is what Paul Wegener said about the golem. The golem is a strange stone form that silently and mystically unfolds its purely visual existence. That's a 1917 statement. In order to better understand the design of the golem, we need to consider Wegener's desire to merge mysticism and mass, the spiritual dimension and the physical presence. So he didn't work alone on all of this. He collaborated with many artists, very well-known painters, sculptors, architects. One of them was Rudolf Belling. He designed the sculpture that is actually worn on the head, the hairpiece. It was here's a closer up of that image. You can tell that there's multiple golems. Golems are always come in doubles. You can see in the next slide sort of what Heidi Schoenemann, very well-known German critic, described as a kind of combination of cubist sculpture. That's Rudolf Belling designing one of his pieces that really can remind you of the head of the golem, and something very ancient, an ancient Egyptian sculpture. So coming back here, I want you also to pay attention. I talked earlier about triangles, how many triangles we have on the costume, all over the dress, but also just the use of ancient looking letters that really make no sense, have no meaning, but are there as a decorative element. And of course, the metal of the triangles that form the 5-point star. It's not a Star of David, it's a 5-point star. That metal capsule really evokes the robot and the fact that this is a modern construct, not just antiquated one. So bringing back sort of elements from the past, from the ancient world to the present, to very, very contemporary ideas about cubism and sculpture. And bringing that all together and melding that into a form. There's another source of inspiration, which is very kind of a Gothic idea, which is Hugo Steiner Prague's illustrations for the Austrian writer Gustav Meyrink's 1915 novel, Der Golem, which became very famous during World War I and sold many, many copies. And you can see here a golem that's not a clay figure, but kind of more a demon, a spirit emerging from the shadows. Looks very different from the golem that Wegener and Belling imagined. But at the same time, if you notice the ghetto in the background and the forms on the top of that image, you can see, again, some of the visual relationships, the arches, the expressive flame-like patterns, the connection to the mysticism to a sort of sinister aspect of the golem. So all of that is also influencing or shaping the golem that came to be in 1920. So Hans Poelzig was a well-known German architect and set designer. He worked on other films as well, and he collaborated with Martha Helena Moschke, who was also an architect and modeler, meaning she was the person who's lately been kind of rediscovered by scholars, was forgotten for a long time. Her contribution to the set design is really important. So Poelzig is well known for a few other very important buildings of that time period. I'm going to show you a few of them, but the one that precedes the set design is what's called the Great Theater in Berlin, which was a theater for the performing arts. You'll see in a minute what I'm talking about. And we also have, collaborating with the two of them, we have the film architect Kurt Richter. So the fact that there's an architect, a film architect, and two architects and a film architect, and they're building models, they're drawing. I can show you here some images of the designs. And I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of work being done on they left behind this archive of sketches, which should reveal a lot about their thought about, what this ghetto could be, or their imagination. It's not like that actually translated fully into what transpired, but this kind of rhythmic patterns up and down sketches, the repetition of these arches that are very the kind of the vertical striving towards the sky. It's not supposed to be static, it's supposed to be a motion. The ghetto strives towards the sky, like the tower that you see in the middle there. So a few more slides and then about Poelzig. So this is, again, really important to emphasize the role of the cinematography in shaping this. So again, we have the architects, the people drawing, modeling, building this, but also filming it in very particular ways. Here, the way the scene is shot really makes us think that we're looking at a landscape, not necessarily at buildings. Our eyes are drawn to those stars right above the tower. So the fact that we are we notice the connection between the starry night and the ghetto establishes kind of this stream coming down from above, learning, gaining knowledge from the skies, but also transporting it down below. The golem itself was imagined by critics, I'm quoting from a 1920 review, as mysteriously connected to the constellation of the stars, which make him at times wild and at times meek, kind of an ebb and flow. So you can see that ebb and flow as the film progresses. And people were already at the time period noticing all of that. And here's the tower. And as you can see, we have so many different moments in which that tower appears, both as the source of knowledge for the rabbi, but then later on as the place where the drama unfolds and the murder, or the, destruction of the stranger, the Christian knight that infiltrates the home, the lover. He comes in, and then finally the collapse of the tower at the end of the film. Really reminded me of a Tower of Babel kind of story. Okay, so the main important design element that connects that tower to the home is the staircase. And you see here Hans Poelzig's actual staircases that he built, one in Posen, Germany, and the other in a movie theater in Berlin. And again, the very circular, flowing kind of staircase is transformed in the 1920 film into this. So I think it's a kind of radicalization of his architecture, because now it's made of clay, it's completely open. He's able to do things for the film set that maybe he couldn't do earlier when he was working with metal in an actual space that humans walk on. And we have here an emphasis on the organic forms, like I said, the ribs or the ears. People have talked about that a lot, but it's also a much more romanticized setting, a lot less industrialized. And also, okay, and here we are kind of looking more at the relationship between the homes and these arches that are present everywhere. This idea of the homes being kind of leaning on each other, almost animated themselves. Again, we saw that in Hugo Steiner Prague's illustrations for Meiling's novel. But that was also, something that caused both the animation of the ghetto, but also critics at the time and later on saw it as a kind of stereotypical representation of Jewish spaces. So they talked about the crookedness of it. Even some critics at the time period said that this is a Jewish Gothic, that there's something Jewish about the appearance of the homes. So this is a really interesting kind of projection onto this particular space of what they thought of as Jewish. If it's crooked or conspiring, leaning together, whispering, the homes are whispering to one another. Those were the kind of terms that were used at the time period. And I always warn, let's look at that a little bit critically. Contrasting to that, we have a film that came out in the same year, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Some of you might have seen it, very, very famous Robert Wiene film. And we have, there's very interesting to look back at this alleyway versus the Caligari one and to think about, yes, there is a three-dimensionality, I guess, but the surfaces are much flatter, much more painted. They have a stronger affinity to cubism. There's sort of a background foreground meshing that eliminates the depth. Versus in the Golem, I think we see much more depth of the sculptures because they were actually built. Okay, they were made out of the clay and wood and straw. You see a lot of straw, and they are really kind of come together. So in a very kind of anti-mimetic way. So I guess if you would call this a more expressionist, flat, painterly aesthetic, the Golem film has a more sculptural aesthetic. It is trying to show that there's something hidden maybe behind the surface, that there's a depth, rather than suggesting that this is all a flat kind of environment, a really artificial one. In the words of Paul Westheim, the architecture in this film is not treated as a background. It has its own life and gesture. The actors strive to harmonize acting and space. They give the spatiality an equal say. So the set design plays a big role in the film. And here you can see a relationship between humans and surroundings through the pointed hats, the Judenhut, what's called in German. The hats that identify these people as Jews are also then echoed in the shadows that the homes cast on the walls over there. So that kind of correspondence that Westheim, a really famous critic, architecture critic, wrote about is really seen in this image. And I talked earlier about Hans Poelzig building this großes Schauspielhaus in Berlin. And here we have a lot of these stalactite, sort of the auditorium, the ceiling was covered, this dome ceiling was covered with these stalactite forms, but it's much more symmetrical. If you look at what's going on here, again, these same kind of, I don't know what to call them, triangular stalactite protrusion from the ceiling they're much thicker, they're less symmetrical, they're more like a growth rather than a sort of pleasant to look at symmetrical shape. But in both cases, really, the idea is to emulate the natural world, to bring it into the man-made. Here you can see Marlene Moschke's sketches for the Imperial Hall. We didn't discuss that at all. It's supposed to be a contrast to the ghetto, and it is a lot more ornamentalized and decadent. And but the designs resemble a tree you see on over down here. So she's also thinking about kind of organic forms and how those decorations of the hall can resemble that flowers, trees, plants. So I'll let you look at that for a second. And then coming back to the ghetto, we also see painted, even though maybe the focus of attention here, we're in the rabbi's laboratory where the artist is working on his creation. But in the background, there's that arched doorway. And boy, how many like arched cavities are there in this film? Like the book is put into one, and then they have to open multiple ones to get down there. And but on it are traces of plant roots or branches. And then when you go upstairs to Miriam's room, and she's really the most orientalized character in the film, you still see that plant design, the little leaves, much more decorative, but still adorning her bedroom. And again, those windows, the arched windows. So we get to the last scene, and we can talk about a lot more, but once more, again, the portal, we didn't discuss the gate to the ghetto is a central design element. It is humongous. I mean, you need a very long shot to bring it out, and the crossbar too, is like a little bit like the star that animates the golem. It has the star in the middle, and it has to be moved. It has to be turned in order to animate the door. So the door is the connection between the Jewish world and the Christian world. It's the entrance, obviously. It's also malleable and can be destroyed like the ghetto itself. But at the same time, even after all that destruction happened, we still see these very thick walls. And I think that's really important that we end there at this moment where it's neither here nor there. It's kind of on the verge, inside out, but the thick walls are still standing. So there's a sense of endurance, of continuity. We're almost looking into the Jewish past. We're kind of looking back in time through the door, right? And in the future or in the present, we have these lovely white dress Christian children sitting with their flowers and their apples and representing supposedly the future. But I don't think that's what Wegener is kind of trying to say, that, you know, to create such a binary juxtaposition, because at the same time, he just showed us a whole film that revolves around the hedonism and the immorality of Christian society and what they've caused through the expulsion, the idea of expulsion. So I think the ideal of the children sitting on the golem really is dependent on the mystical interiority that's back there behind those walls. And really, without the Jewish past, we can't have this Christian future. It's dependent on it. And that's why he ends by projecting the Star of David onto the closed ghetto. We see the ghetto now from the outside, kind of, we no longer can penetrate into it. And it's kind of a self-reflexive commentary on the film that ties it to a modern Jewish utopia, the idea of national independence, which is emerging at this time period. But note that the star is made of clay, like the golem and like the ghetto, so we can see the dimensionality of that star. So maybe it too is not a static utopia, but a malleable, changeable one. Maybe that's what he's trying to say, or maybe I'm just hoping for that. So with that, I'm ending, and I have a few more images, but we can talk about them later. But we do have, I think, some time for quick Q&A. So I'd be really happy to, or for your comments. I know you're coming from different areas of the visual arts, film, sculpture, painting, materiality, digital art, whatever you, costume design. So I'd really love to hear your questions.
I see that Wegener survived until 1948. How did he manage that?
Yeah, he became a Nazi, and he's that's colored a lot of the criticism of his films, and I think unfairly, because we're in 1920. But he became an actor who worked on Nazi film. I mean, he wasn't like an active Nazi, he was already in his. So when he made this film, he was 40, I want to say 7 or 8. And so like he's acting in Nazi cinema, but he's not, he's not doing anything beyond, he's already in his 60s or something. So if you put it together, but of course that history has cast a dark shadow on his past as well.
Hi. Let's see. First, I want to make a comment. As far as the architecture, it's very similar to Gaudi's architecture in terms of the organic
Caligari, the Cabinet of Caligari.
No,
Oh,
uh,
sorry.
Antonio Gaudí in
Oh, Gaudi.
Barcelona.
Yes, people have made that connection. That's
So
true.
I don't know what he knew about the actual architecture, but the expressionistic style was very prominent already in painting and a lot of other art. So it's not really completely, it's not so innovative in that sense. I had two questions, I guess.
Mhm.
One was about the story itself and whether it's not clear to me. The film seems to be based on the book. Is that correct? Uh, uh, or the story that's in the film. I just wonder how that relates to Shelley's Frankenstein,
Mm.
chronologically and historically, if there's any connection
It goes
about
the other way
that.
around.
And the second question is, to what extent was this film actually shown in Germany? What kind of audience did it have? Who might have seen it, and what kinds? Is there any, critique of it? What happened in the 30s? Did they ban the film? What's the political, socio-political consequences of the film?
Wow, that's so. Just briefly, thank you for bringing in the other. There are other architects and other people working in that kind of same spirit. Yeah, this film is not based on any specific text like Frankenstein or Meyerink or anything like that. I think it really draws. It's very eclectic. I think it draws motifs. I traced it from a variety of works of literature that he could have accessed in German. Regarding Frankenstein, that work could have been inspired by the German Golem rendition by Jacob Grimm that appeared before Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, and she could have read that. So it's kind of interesting to think it might have been the other way around, but they're very, very different monster figures. And then in terms of the screening of the film in the 1920s, it was a huge success. That's why we have so many export copies, because it was seen as a real triumph of the German film industry. People really extolled everything you saw today, and the music and the acting and people were just amazed by the set design. That was the main thing that critics really focused on, and the acting, and Wegener's acting as Golem was seen as marvelous, and therefore it just continued. But obviously, after the Weimar silent film era ended, a lot of those films, celluloid was melted and used for other purposes. So yeah, in Germany. So when they moved to talking films and color films, a lot of those films were lost. So I hope I answered some of your questions.
I I found this film very confusing. Maybe that's could be, but one thing, and perhaps I'm wrong. In my learning, the call Golem, and it's even said this in the beginning, was a rather benign kind of figure that would come in when there was a big threat with Jews. I sort of in your talk, I think you're concentrating a lot on the filmography, but I see every stereotype that's ever been about Jews, in negative ones, in this film. Maybe I'm looking at it in the wrong, in a different kind of way, or a 21st century way. I mean, okay, it's 1920, very early Weimar, before Weimar, towards the end, began getting closer and closer and closer to Nazi stuff. This is supposed to be taking place in medieval times, am I right? Something like that?
Yeah, early modern,
but still,
like 16th century.
Interesting that it was a success, but I can't help thinking that non-Jewish people would see every stereotype that they've ever thought in this, and nothing very good, frankly. I don't think. Even the costumes, the beards of the men. I mean, I don't know. I don't know exactly what I'm trying to say, but if I leave out the design and the kinds of things you're talking about, I see a film that promotes Jewish negative stereotypes. That's what I see. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very, very important comment. I mean, it's a big question about this film and the way the Jews are portrayed in it. I mean, I think that this is like an issue we can have different viewpoints on in terms of what Wegener is trying to do here. There are a lot of negative ideas here. I noticed this time around viewing it how the guard at the portal taking the money. I mean, that was suddenly that popped out to me. The daughter, and as a kind of femme fatale, the scheming kind of helper. But the rabbi and his creative like abilities are something that we have to recognize here as like a very, very important force. Of course, he is dealing with demons and forcing them to reveal the name. There's nothing about what he's doing that's related to Jewish mysticism at all. Yeah. So maybe there's other thoughts about that. Yeah.
Hi. There's one specific frame kind of early on when the rabbi's sculpting the golem's face, and it's kind of a mess of fingerprints, and it's not a face yet, and it's very like the materiality of the clay is really emphasized. And then on the other end of the film, you can see those same hand marks on the walls outside of the ghetto. And I just thought it was really, it really stuck out to me about kind of the connection between the architecture and the golem himself being of the same stuff, and then the implications of that. And I couldn't help but wonder when the little girl tosses the star, if that touches the earth, is that earth then going to animate itself? Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting there cinematically is how extensive that scene, how extended the animation is. This is different from any other kind of golem story I've seen, is how much time is spent showing the kneading of the clay through cross cutting, which is a way to extend temporality and kind of suggest connection across time and space. That's used a lot in this film. All the cuts between the court and the ghetto are really connecting the two. And here the clay, the molding of the clay becomes a thing onto itself. It's like almost like the goal of the molding is forgotten when we're so submerged in clay. Yeah. So that ability to bring us into the clay is really important. I want to just refer back to the previous comment and say that the idea of the golem who runs amok and destroys the ghetto is already there, very much there in 19th century renditions by Jews of this story. Oftentimes the rabbi can prevent that from happening, from complete destruction. But in some of the tales, the rabbi is himself like destroyed in the process, or the ghetto is destroyed. So the idea of the danger inherent in artificial creation is really an important part of that. And I wouldn't call that necessarily the anti-Semitic motif. I think where the anti-Semitism comes up is in the little details, like that money handling, or those little like moments where I feel like, yes, it's a stab of a certain kind, or it's kind of, or maybe sort of an ancient motif rearing its ugly head of money lending and all that stuff.
But just before we get to the next one, back to Abby's question.
Yes.
I mean, the idea of sculpting the face in clay is, of course, goes back to the creation of Adam out of the earth, of the ground, right? And the end scene is exactly that. The golem goes back to the earth. Right? And there's all this polarity between nature and clay. Earth is the Jewish world, and nature is the Christian world, right? Celebration of trees, which is something is very Germanic, and you find it in festivals in Bavaria and elsewhere, in which, the feast of going to the forest, which is what you have in the dance hall, right? This carving that looks like trees, sacred trees, right? While Jews, or the Jewish culture, which is the culture of clay and the making of Adam, the creation, right? Earthness. And the end scene is exactly the victory of naturalism or nature over clay,
but not quite, because he will go back into the ghetto. Yeah. He will be retrieved by the Jews and raised up like a hero on their shoulders and carried back in. So it's kind of, so that's why I think you cannot disconnect the two. The film is trying to argue for a deep connection.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit later, but it's what is it called? The Blue Mountain movie group that Lenny Riefenstahl originates from that. So that's kind of the beginnings of all of that. Please.
Yes, great. Thank you so much for pointing that out.
You talked about the literary sources, but the artistic influences are melded. There's a very strong organic Art Nouveau influence in the design, as well as Cubism.
Yes.
And it's all put into a framework, an expressionistic framework.
Here you
Even
see
the
a little bit of the
reflection of the acting and the characters, it reminds me very much of an expressionistic painting too, with the rabbi. And there is not Jewish mysticism, but there is astrology and other elements mixed into this in a
a
very,
real mishmash, wouldn't you call it?
yes, a melange,
A melange.
a real melange of styles. It's not a pure thing, but it's very interesting, and they play off each other in different parts of the film. And there's this strong organic sense with the buildings, the people, the golem, and the creation of something physical.
Thank you. That's wonderful the way you put it. Yeah, and this image I pulled up because it really brings together the cubism, perhaps the Jugendstil or the expressionist like patterns, and the astrology behind them.
Oh, I just wanted to ask about the scene at the court where the rabbi shows the court his I guess the ancestor,
Yes,
the ancient
it's
Jews.
a film within a film.
Right. That was really striking. This sort of cinema as magic trick.
It's a cinematic moment.
Yeah,
It's meta cinematic.
And then the court is sort of subject to, I guess, divine retribution for violating the rules of the cinema, almost like making a disturbance or making a mockery of the show. I just thought that was a really striking, almost like meta comment, and I wanted to hear what you thought about
completely. That. I mean, he's a film. He's not just creator or animator of a golem, but he's almost like a magic lantern projectionist or a kind of a proto or early filmmaker of sorts. And what he's showing them is the history of his people, the history of expulsion, the history of wandering, the very anti-Semitic idea of the wandering Jew. And as it comes closer, it gets larger and larger and looms over them as though it was a golem itself, and some of the eye motions of the wandering Jew, and he really like is a mirror image to the golem. But at that moment, they are misbehaving in the audience. They're supposed to learn to be quiet, to sit still in a movie theater. Of course, that was not the norm in the cinema and the Nickelodeon or in other movie theaters. And you too also laughed a bit, so that's fine. But for them, it meant a calamity, and actually the extreme. There's some. Let me just see if I can. I didn't show this, but I really love this. This is actually an UFA. UFA is the national German film production company that made this film. They created this production still with all the injured and dead lying on the floor, and the golem having the way he protects them has been compared to kind of a Samson figure, but it's the reverse, like he's holding it up instead of tearing down the temple. He's holding up their temple.
Great. On that beautiful note, let us thank Maya for a lovely lecture, and